Hello, welcome to 92Y. I'm Jennifer Hausler, Assistant Director of 92Y Talks, and I have the pleasure of planning the lecture series here and welcoming the greatest minds of the world to our stage. 92Y is a Jewish institution. Our mission statement calls for us to serve people of every racial, religious, ethnic, and economic background. So we welcome everyone to our tent, and we hope you'll pick up our catalog, go to our website at 92y.org and sign up for our e-news, and see that there really is no place like this in New York or anywhere in the world. Tonight, Bill and Judith Moyers, along with their son William, will discuss their experience with Susan Cheever. They'll take questions, and afterwards they're going to sign copies of William's new book, Now What? An Insider's Guide to Addiction and Recovery. And before I introduce our moderator tonight, I want to make sure to thank the Hazelden for everyone's help putting this event together. It was really terrific working with you all. Susan Cheever is the best-selling author of 13 previous books, including My Name is Bill Wilson, which is about the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. But the real reason she's here is because, like everyone on this stage, and I assume most of you here in this room tonight, she has an intimate connection to addiction and has written so sensitively and insightfully about it. Please welcome Susan Cheever.
Jennifer. Perfect. Thank you. So it's an honor and a privilege to take part in this amazing panel that we're going to have tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing Judith and Bill Moyers, and I'm a little bit in awe of them, which you'll notice when we're in the chairs, but I'm going to try to not let that show. So Bill and Judith have been married for 58 years, which I think is amazing. They've won dozens of Emmys and Peabody Awards for their series of astonishing television shows. They've really reinvented public television, or invented public television as we know it. They're a couple on fire for justice. They embody a fierce tradition of service, and they've developed an almost magical platform from which they can teach. Their PBS series on addiction, Close to Home, was one of the most moving, comprehensive treatments of this sometimes mysterious problem. And in his current show, Moyers and Company, Bill and Judith continue their crusade. I don't know if they'll like having it called a crusade, but that's how I see it. We're also here to celebrate their eloquent, equally passionate son, William, and his terrific book, Now What?, in which he combines stunning personal testimony with sensible and comprehensive advice for addicts and those who have to deal with addicts. So please help me welcome the Moyers family. Yay, yay. So, as you can see, there's a lot of intelligence and success and glamour up here on this stage tonight. But we're all people who've been turned inside out and had our hearts broken by addiction. As parents, or as alcoholics and addicts, or as children, or both, we represent that many-sided evil, and I call it evil thoughtfully. That profound, confusing collateral damage that happens when someone can't stop drinking or drugging. So before we start, we're going to do something that I think will be very exciting, which I've never done before with the format. We're not going to have the Q&A just at the end. We're going to try to have a 5-way dialogue between the four of us and the audience. And the way we're going to try to do this is, as we talk, you can take those 3x5 cards that I hope you have in your hands and write a question and pass it over to the usher. And then as we continue, about every 15 minutes, somebody will come to the edge of the stage, give me some questions, and we'll answer your questions right then, so that it won't just be first us and then you. You'll be able to ask questions as we go forward. I hope that's clear. Also, I'm supposed to remind you that your questions have a better chance of being answered if they are legible. So I'm going to come and sit down now and start asking my questions. And my first question is to William, and it is, why did you call this book Now What?
Well, it's a good question, Susan. I titled the book Now What because that was the question that popped into my head on the morning of October the 12th of 1994 when I was in a full-blown relapse from my addiction to alcohol and other drugs. I was in a crack house in Atlanta, Georgia. I had abandoned my wife and 2 young boys, walked away from my job and chosen to pursue oblivion to the point that I was in dire straits again. And on that morning of October 12th of 94, when I was at the end of my rope, perhaps literally and figuratively, I had the question pop into my head right in front of me, and it was, now what? And in that moment, I couldn't answer the question, probably for the first time in my life. My parents had always taught me that I could do just about anything I wanted to do as long as I put my mind to it, and I was successful at what I had done. I'd been raised to know the difference between right and wrong and good and bad and moral and immoral, and yet there I was.
So why did you write the book?
Well, I wrote the book for 2 reasons, because when I couldn't answer that question is the moment that I said, okay, I'm done, Moyers, and I surrendered, if you will. I didn't give up, I gave in, and I took the good advice of the professionals who were going to teach me the tools that I needed to learn to get sober and stay sober with this chronic disease. And ever since, I've sort of been a public advocate for helping people get help who have that same question. And so I wrote the book, titling it Now What, after my own experience, and also because of the thousands of questions that I get in my role at the Hazelden Foundation from people who are facing the same question, addicts and alcoholics themselves, their families, their employers, their communities. So I wrote the book really to explain, to help people with 2 elements of this cunning, baffling, and powerful illness. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book is for this, and I'll read just briefly from it. It's from the first chapter of the book called Swiss Cheese, The Addict's Brain on Drugs. And its little subtitle is called Trying to Make Sense of Addiction. Making sense of addiction is far from easy. In 2011, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, ASAM, updated its definition of addiction. On its website, its 3,000-word footnoted definition begins this way, quote, addiction is a primary chronic disease of the brain, reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Addiction affects neurotransmission and interactions within reward structures of the brain, including the nucleus accumbens, anterior cingulate cortex, basal forebrain, and amygdala, I hope I pronounced that right, such that motivational hierarchies are altered and addictive behaviors, which may or may not include alcohol and other drug use, supplant healthy, self-care related behaviors. The definition goes on to say, addiction also affects neurotransmission and interactions between cortexal and hippocampal circuits and brain reward structures, such as the memory of previous exposures to rewards, such as food, sex, alcohol, and other drugs, leads to a biological and behavioral response to external cues, in turn triggering cravings and/or engagement in addictive behaviors. Close quote. And then I go on to write, wow, even I really didn't get it, and that's my brain they're describing. And so I wrote this book to help people understand what is in fact going on in that intricate circuitry of our brains. But I also wrote the book based on, as I said, the thousands of letters and emails and Facebook messages and text messages and visits to my front porch in St. Paul, and a lot of the questions that you all get, inquiries that you all get. I wrote this book based on this letter, which I think captures the essence of probably what we're all doing here this evening in one way, shape, or form. Dear Mr. Moyers, help, my son is dying. I read your book, Broken, that says to hate this disease, not the person. But so help me God, I hate him more than I love him right now. And this mother goes on to write in conclusion, I am begging you, if there is any way my son can be helped, please help me find it. Please help Scott to save himself, Mr. Moyers. You are my last hope. And so I wrote this book in part also to help give people hope.
Great answer.
Well done.
So on that note, Judith, it's just amazing to have the three of you together to talk about this. What was it like for you when you, for instance, went searching for William in Harlem and, you know, eventually found him and begged him to come home and wept and begged him to come home and he couldn't or wouldn't? What was it like for you to be that mother?
Well, in 1989, William was 30 years old. We hadn't had any trouble with him in his entire life. We didn't have an adolescent breakdown with him. We have 2 other children, so I know what that's about. You know, we should have been suspicious when we didn't have an adolescent breakdown. But we weren't, because he seemed to do everything right. He was just a golden boy, beloved in his community and in his family. He played all sports. He usually made the first team. He played in the band, and that wasn't sufficient. So he played in the orchestra and the jazz band too. He couldn't quite get enough of anything. And
Well said.
so, and he had been married several years, had a great job. He'd had a job since he was about 13 years old. He always had a job, in addition to going to school. And so when he disappeared at age 30, and through a series of, because of assistance from a great friend of mine, William Josephson, who was our friend and our lawyer, Bill Josephson and I were able to find the general location in Harlem where he must be. Bill was out of the country. And so we went to Harlem. It's one of the hottest days of history in August. And we hung out. And we were pretty obvious. I had on a blue linen dress. And Bill Josephson is a one-armed man. So we're walking the streets around there until we finally did locate the building that he was in. And we did that by throwing ourselves on the mercy of the people on the street, and some of them were helpful. I remember saying to one woman, I think my son's in there. And he's sick. I think he's sick. And I need to get in there to see about him. And then later I said to that same woman, when she reappeared on the street, if I don't see him soon, I'm going to get the police to help me go in this building. But upon that, he came out. He came out a few minutes after I had said that to her. And when I saw him, I was shocked out of my wits, because this handsome, healthy, marathon running, there's another one, person didn't even look like my son. He had his big blue eyes were golden yellow. And I had never seen him drunk or stoned ever in my life. And I knew nothing about the disease. I had no first-hand experience with the disease of addiction. I didn't know it was a disease. And so from there, I did ask him to come home with me. He said no. But he said, I'm going to go home, but it's going to be under my own steam. And he did. He did go home. And I went home too. Bill Joseph and I went home, and we began to say, what shall we do? It's sort of a now what thing. Right. Now what do we do? Because we didn't know. We didn't know where to reach out for help. And in 1989, the stigma was still so great. It still is great, isn't it?
It still is great.
That we didn't tell our best friends. Bill came home immediately. We didn't tell even our best friends what had happened. We didn't tell our families what had happened. And so we were reaching out for help in a very blind fashion until finally a great friend of mine, Ann Maluk, said, you know, I think you might need to talk a little bit to me. And I did, and we got to it. It turned out she had 2 sons who had been to treatment. I didn't know that either.
What was it like for you, Bill?
It was like falling into a deep hole, like the Roadrunner in the old comic strip. You're ginning along, the world's responding to you, you're moving swiftly through it, and suddenly the earth opens and you fall into it. Dark, strange, scary. As Judith said, we had a model son. We never expected anything like this or saw any exhibition of a behavior that would anticipate it. And just suddenly, the road disappears in front of you, a familiar road, one you've traveled on, one you're comfortable with, one you've negotiated. And suddenly you're in this bottomless hole because you never hit the bottom as you're reaching out, trying to figure out how to stop your fall and how to get help. So, I mean, that's the metaphor that I experienced. Maybe I didn't at the moment. As I look back on it, that's how I felt. Our first instinct was to find some medical help by going to a couple of old friends of ours who were doctors from Washington days, one at Emory and one at
Mayo's.
Mayo's Clinic, right, one at Mayo's Clinic, and they recommended Hazelden, and I'd never heard of Hazelden. I don't know if you had either, but we were able, you know, it helps to have, this is why you feel for people who are alone. It helps to have contacts. It helps to have means of reaching other people.
If you could say something to your 1989 self, what would it be?
Don't panic. Don't panic.
Okay.
Take a deep, this is common sense advice, deep breath, and turn and trust the companion you have if you have one. And we were both very fortunate that we were in this together. And I would just say, don't panic. A lot of parents I know panic, a lot shrivel in shame, others recoil in anger, because we've gotten to know a lot of people through the years. It was helpful to me when we were at the family week in Hazelden after William had arrived there, began his treatment. I really thought I was sort of alone in this. I didn't know anybody who had been through it, didn't know them well. As the meeting was about to begin, the door opened and like 5 wet chickens following the rooster into the room came a family from Little Rock, Arkansas, a well-known banker and his children in declining height right behind him. And they looked as if they had been in a rainstorm and a thunderstorm and were lost. And suddenly I felt, and I say this in the opening of William's book, I suddenly felt I really wasn't alone. You do have that sense in a well, of a hole of being alone. The important thing that I discovered is to find some support. But, you know, if you don't mind, what did your father do when it happened to you?
Well, my father did sort of the opposite of what you and Judith did, although it was a different situation. This may just be rationalization, but I like to think I was holding it together pretty well. You know, I wasn't say, living in a crack house. I was married with did I have a child? I had a car, that kind of thing. I had a job. And when my father got sober, his getting sober was very dramatic. He had been about as bad as you can be, really half dead, and then he went to rehab. He went to Smithers for 28 days, and he came out a different man, and within a year he had won the Pulitzer Prize and had a book that was #1 on the bestseller list for 6 months, and a couple other things, and I thought, well, that looks good. And but he never said anything to me. He did 2 things which later made me realize that he thought I had a drinking problem. One is he took me to meetings. He would say, I'm going to an AA meeting, why don't you come along? This is in 1975, right? The stories are great, you'll really like it. So I'd go to these meetings and I'd say, I wish I was an alcoholic. Thank you so much for helping my father. But he never, they just were hands off. And the other thing he did, I was telling you this, when we would have lunch together, he was always on time, the way sober people are, and I was always 15 minutes late, the way drunks are. And when I would get to the restaurant, my drink would always be waiting for me. He would have already ordered my drink. And if you're an alcoholic, as indeed I am and was, when you walk into the restaurant and you see your drink waiting for you there, it's a beautiful moment. And he knew that. He knew to order the drink in advance. So it was he really went for attraction, not promotion. He never said anything. He just modeled it.
Susan, it's a little different, though, for a crack addict. Your
It is
parents don't
different.
have the
It is
crack there
different.
waiting for you when you...
It was a little different.
And I'm wondering if I had ever been a drunk, I'd have won the Pulitzer Prize.
Well, there you go.
I may try that yet.
I got sober and I didn't win it, so I don't know. No, he had a storybook sobriety, I like to say. It really changed. And he went from being this nightmare of a guy, as you may know from your own experience, to being a saint. He started washing the dishes and learning to cook. I mean, it was really quite something.
I didn't have, and that's where I think the power of this book also helps people, in that I did not have a storybook sobriety after you all had been at the family program at Hazelden in the fall of 1989, because I didn't stay sober out of that experience. I didn't stay sober the second time either. And then I had a period of I don't say sobriety, but I had a period of abstinence. I wasn't recovering my mind and my body and my spirit, but I wasn't using. During the early part of the 90s, that ultimately caught up with me in yet another relapse, and the one that led to my now what moment.
You had 5 years of relapse and
I was in and out of recovery for 5 years. It was hardly a storybook.
I was never as frightened the first time as I was the second and third time. I don't know if we've ever talked about that, but every relapse scared me more than the first collapse.
Well, I didn't believe in relapse in the beginning.
Right, there's that great thing in the book, right?
The very first day of the family program at Hazelden in 1989, the subject was relapse. And I said quietly to myself, not my son. No. He's great. He's well disciplined. He can do anything he puts his mind to. He'll be fine. He'll be fine. And even though I remember her saying, and cocaine is particularly dangerous for relapse, and because you think they're doing well. And I said, no, I'm sure not. That won't ever happen. So I think I took the relapse harder, maybe, because then I had to examine my own understanding of the disease, and I had to get real.
So have you been busy writing your questions?
Here they are coming out stage
they
right
coming
or
out?
stage left.
Oh, great. Okay. What do you think? Is it time to do this?
Sure.
Sure. You're the boss.
Yeah,
If only.
if only.
Oh, how do you think our society does with getting people the help they need? This is a planted question. And it enables me to say that we're not doing very well at all. We're in the middle of a public education crisis when it comes to addiction, that even the New York Times is saying that 1 in 10 people who need help get help, and that the help they get often isn't very good. And, what is that about? I mean, where is the Framingham study for addiction? Where is the research money for addiction? Where are our numbers? Where are the people? Where's the Million Addict March? Where are people standing up and really addressing this issue? Mm-hmm. So that's my answer.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. I love the Million Addict idea.
Okay, so here's a real question. Oh, you're an alcoholic.
I thought that was familiar, Henry.
This is actually another trick question, which I already answered. You're an alcoholic. How did your family deal with that? You already have the answer for that. Here's a real one. How would you define an addict's bottom to a person who is not an addict or an alcoholic?
An addict's what?
Bottom.
Good
question. I think you do beautifully with that in the book.
Thanks, Susan. And it is it's a critical point in the process of the spiral downward. There's this, one of the efforts I make in the book is to sort of bust the myths about addiction and treatment and recovery and relapse. And oftentimes we take a position, if we're a family member, that we have to let the addict or the alcoholic hit bottom. But I can tell you that if my parents had allowed me to hit bottom, I would be dead. And I believe that the only bottom with this illness is death, and that anything short of that is a way out. And so the whole notion, the myth that we have to let the addict or the alcoholic hit bottom is a very dangerous one, because if the addict or the alcoholic is allowed to do that, they're not likely to get that chance that I got more than once to come back, which is why intervention is important, which is why the family staying connected, the employer staying connected is important. Even while the addict is spiraling downward, it's so important for the people that love the addict to stay in contact with them, even while they set their boundaries and make sure that the addict doesn't roll over their own lives.
I would accentuate a different point here. I think we saw your bottom. We didn't allow you to hit bottom, but we found you at the bottom. The third relapse, we'd come home from a weekend in Vermont and got a call that he had relapsed, 2 little children in Atlanta where he was working with CNN. We immediately went down there. I think we left that evening, maybe the next morning. And you were gone. And we searched again. We got the police involved. We finally, with an interventionist, found where you were secluded in a crack house. We staked you out, took turns watching for you. Finally, when you came out and had that same gray pallor that you had, your mother described across town, we realized we had to act. So we went to the police. The police sent 2 detectives. We remained in the car while the detectives, armed, went to the door and knocked on the door, threatened to force their way in unless they sent you out. You came out, and you were death. You were at the end. I think you were just a few hours, maybe a day, maybe more. Memory fades after all this time, but I realized you were at whatever you all call the bottom, and so were we, so was I. No more. We have a difference over what I said to you in the van, and that's the function of different positions of memory. But I was finished. I would have allowed you. I said to you, I can do no more, and I meant it. It wasn't that I was following the policy, let them hit bottom. It was just there was nothing else to do. The third relapse and the desperation and the near death, there was nothing to do but recognize our rope was at an end, not only yours. But had you died, I would have blamed myself.
Well, and I talk to families all the time whose loved one doesn't make it with the illness, because as we know at Hazelden or wherever else we get help, that there really are only 2 outcomes with the illness. One is to recover from it, and the other one is to die, ultimately, if we don't recover. But I run into families all the time who question whether they did enough to help their spouse or their loved one. And what I've often told people is if you've tried to do everything that you can, including keeping those lines of communication open, not turning your back on me when I was at my sickest point. You, in fact, were fully engaged even though you'd had it. If you hadn't done that, I probably wouldn't have made it. As you said, I was pretty close to the end. And even with the families whose loved ones don't make it, oftentimes they can live with themselves, as difficult as it is, if they know in their own hearts that they've done everything they could for that person, even if the outcome wasn't what they had hoped. I have a question here that says, what do you do if you don't want to live? Well, to whomever wrote this question, I encourage you to get help immediately. If you're feeling that if you don't want to live, that's a serious feeling and demands that you get help right away, even tonight, if that's your mindset. And there are people in the audience who are perfectly positioned to help you get help. The key is to ask for help. The key is to ask for help, even if you don't want to live. Even in my sickest moments, there were moments when I couldn't imagine living with drugs any more than I could imagine living without them. I didn't know what to do, and if it hadn't been for the support that I had in my community, including my family and my employer and others, my church, then perhaps I would have been able to consummate that feeling that I had that I didn't want to live anymore. But I was ready for the help that was offered to me, and I can tell you, to whomever wrote the question, that there is help here available as long as you are ready to ask for help and can believe in hope.
And I think that question is asking for help,
yes,
actually,
I do.
To whoever wrote it. Okay, here's a question for Bill. You once pointed out that the neurological description of the disease of addiction sounded like a description of learning.
Of what?
Learning. Do you really believe addiction is a disease, or is disease just a metaphor? I think that's the real meat of it, right?
Well, let Judith tell you about how Dr. Steve Hyman came into our life, and then I will answer that question. Dr. Steve Hyman, you describe him.
At Harvard, right?
He was at Harvard at the time. I was at Hazelden for a meeting of some sort, and the Hazelden people had arranged for Dr. Hyman to come from Harvard and speak to us, Stephen Hyman. And he had this was about 1990, I guess. It was today it was primitive PowerPoint presentation, very, very primitive. And he had these little drawings that he projected up on a screen of the brain. And he showed the limbic brain. And there were people in that room who had had 30 years of sobriety. And they themselves had not gotten hold of the concept that it was a disease. And I certainly hadn't, and I learned that this is a disease. It has physical definitions. So I don't know what you want to say more than that.
Well, and she came in, I hadn't been at this lecture. Dr. Hyman, the neuroscientist from Harvard, had come over. And so driving back from Hazelden to St. Paul, you said, he was so fascinating. You should talk to him as a journalist and see if there's something we can't do there. Right. So we got back from St. Paul to New York, and we decided and I did talk to him on the phone, and we decided to do the series. I think it's the most difficult and impactful series we've done of 1,000 hours of television that we've accomplished together over the years. So we set out to raise the money. We raised the money for every penny of every production. And the second broadcast in that series, still valid even though the science has changed somewhat, the second broadcast was called The Hijacked Brain. That was his term. When I went up to interview him with our cameras, he said, I'm going to show you how the brain is hijacked. And thanks to great camera work and his skill and graphics, we showed how the brain is actually affected like a disease when alcohol and crack and cocaine enter it. And that was a learning experience for me, and we collectively said, let's see if we can, journalists are generalists. who are licensed to explain things they don't understand. And to do that, you have to learn. So what we learned about addiction in our lived experience with William Cope and from our reporting as journalists, we turned into that series. We also learned it from recovering people. The first hour in that series was called Profile of Addiction. Portrait of Addiction. And we had maybe 2 or 3 of those people are here tonight. We had about 11 recovering people of all walks of life, every race, every gender. And I interviewed them each for about 2 hours with Judith there. And then we cut those into no narration, just one after another describing their experience. You can't watch that without learning what no book, except this one, can tell you. And so that's what I mean. You know, look, we journalists don't know a tenth of what you think we know. We learn it, we share it, we promptly forget it. I haven't forgotten this because it was, as the series was called, close to home.
What happened to you as a family after that series aired?
Well, we get phone calls still every week. Since William decided to be public with his recovery about his addiction, and so we said, well, okay, we can all be public, and I'm in a 12-step group too. Was there friction about that within your family? No.
In other words, William said, I'm going to go public, and you said, we're coming with you.
We'll do that too. I think, because we felt we were so really knocked out by the fact that we were so ignorant about addiction. Bill had an uncle and I had a brother-in-law who were alcoholic, and that's all we knew about it. They didn't live near us, they lived 1,000 miles away. And we had in mind that model of what a person is like if they're addicted. We did not have in mind a high-functioning person. And that was the start of what we needed to learn, that this person's not necessarily lying on a grate down in the Bowery. This person is not necessarily homeless. This can be any one of us, of our people, all of us. It can be any of us. And we used to say, to promote the series, we spoke to groups all over the country, and we went our separate ways to do that. And I would always say, and I think Bill did too, to some, like the American Medical Association, for example, or the American Bar Association, if you think you are separate from this issue or this problem, just look to your left and look to the right. One of the 3 of you has an intimate relationship to addiction. Maybe you do. The person to your left or your right may. It can be somebody in your family. It can be somebody in your office, your boss, your pastor. It can be anybody. It can be anybody. This is not restricted to one kind of person.
But it was difficult for us. We had our differences over how to respond. We didn't know, as Judith said, we had no experience, so I felt inclined at times to take one step this way, and she, from her own DNA and knowledge, wanted to take that step. It was not easy, and we were fortunate. I mean, we remain fortunate to this moment because, as so many of you know, the attrition rate of this disease is very high. What is it?
Well, it depends on who you ask and how you measure it, and that's part of the problem that we have in terms of our public policy and public perception. But, it's a chronic disease. So with any chronic disease, there's going to be relapse. There is an attrition rate. There is a remission rate as well. We know at Hazelden that 53% of our patients report that they're continuously abstinent in the year to year and a half after they've been treated, but relapse is part of the illness.
So you don't know how to respond. You don't know the small things, like when you were out of work because of your situation, and you came home, and we didn't know whether to give you money or not give you money. We thought if we gave you or loaned you money, I mean, we differed at that
I remember
from time
those
to time.
days, yeah.
It would be an inducement. It would be we'd be enabling. I never heard the term enabling in this sense until all of this. And Judith would say, "You're enabling him," and I would say, "No, you're enabling him."
And I'd say, neither one of you is enabling me. It's okay.
Happy times at the Moyers house.
Well, you know, there just as Dr. William White has so well put it, I think there are many paths to recovery. And there are just so many different ways of dealing with this, and it has so much to do with personalities and family histories and all of that. You have to really feel your way. And for me, I needed a group of people who had been through similar experiences, and that's why I found my 12-step group enormous, and do still find that enormously helpful. That in those groups, when you're sharing experiences, you do learn. And you learn from each other, and then you can model your own behaviors and plans and so on, because you learn how other people have done it too.
I think that's one of the great messages that I get from this book, and in fact, from everything you guys do, which is I may be confused and I may get it wrong, but I'm not alone. And that's really such a wonderful thing, because I think the way the disease works, if it's a disease, it isolates you. And you think, I'm the only person who's dealt with this child, this father, this whatever it is. And the stigma isolates you further. And you don't want to call your friends and say, you know, I think my children have asked me not to talk about them, so I'm trying very hard not to talk about them. But you don't want to call your friends and say, I have this problem or that problem. You know, and you feel completely alone with it. And I think...
So let me come back to whomever wrote that card, what you do if you don't want to live. You talk to somebody tonight. You may not know that person. You may talk to somebody and tell that somebody why you wrote that card. I mean, if you want to talk to one of us or Susan or anybody after this is over, this is a lonely society. This is an uncaring society. You asked that question about why we don't do enough. Look, our society is careening over the top in so many areas. Everything in excess. Too much money in politics. Too many drugs. Too many guns. Too much alcohol. Too little discipline. We rank way down the scale on our social safety net, on our care for mentally ill, for our way down on our treatment for alcohol and recovery. It's not a caring society, but somebody does care. And whoever wrote that card, who may be thinking, I don't want to live, just reach out to somebody. Maybe it's a 50-50 chance that person is intuitive and compassionate and knows what to do, but don't go home alone having written that card.
And you know, Dad, to that point, I mean, this room is filled with people who, I'm taking a guess here, but everybody made an effort to be here tonight, and with the storm threatening and lots of other things going on. My hunch is that in a room like this, there are a lot of people who have been exactly where the person who wrote this card has been. And there are a lot of people who've come back from that experience, from that desperate moment as well. Professionals who work in the field, my colleagues, other fellow travelers, people who've been in recovery, those who've overcome mental illness. This room is, I think, packed with people. As you said, Mom, if you turn to your left or your right, it's not 1 out of every 3. Tonight, it's probably 3 out of every 3.
Let me ask you, I never have asked you this question, was there a moment when you didn't want to live?
Yes, and that moment I didn't want to live was and thanks for asking it that way. That moment that I didn't want to live came with the despair of relapse and feeling the shame that I felt about the fact I couldn't get on top of this issue of my own free will, all by myself, darn it. And yet at the same time, I couldn't envision a life without the substances that I was using to the point of near death. So there were a lot of moments, but I never once doubted that other people wanted me to live.
That's a good thing. That's well said.
What about you? Did you ever not want to live?
I didn't want to live.
So?
It's dangerous to say that in this culture, let me just say, so please don't tell my doctors. I'll never get another prescription for Synthroid. I mean, you know, this stuff goes on your medical records, and I didn't want to live, and that was my bottom. I looked fine on the outside. I had 2 little kids and a wonderful husband, and lived in a townhouse up here, and I just didn't want to live. We have sort of opposite stories. I knew I was not an alcoholic. I knew that my problem was my husband's drinking. And so I went to meetings to get him help. And I had been to meetings before with my father. And, you know, for me, and again, this is a stroke of amazing luck, meetings just worked. I mean, I went to meetings and talked about how I wasn't an alcoholic, and they all just said, oh, keep coming back, keep coming back. And, you know, they didn't say, well, what are you doing here? And it worked for me. I started to get better. He's still drinking, you know. So I sort of backed into it, but pretty quickly I did want to live again. And I didn't understand that alcohol is a powerful depressant. And that, you know, I was using it to help with my depression, but it was digging the hole deeper all the time. So it's not a good feeling.
And if I may, I never asked you this either. Was there a moment when you thought he was going to die?
There was a moment when I finally bought what I had been told many times, which was, I didn't cause it, I cannot control it, I cannot cure it. Because I thought, oh, if we just all tried harder, you know, it would get better. It would be solved. You know, it would be solved, and it would be over. It would be over if I just could do that. No, but I know what you want me to tell. I'm not married 58 years from now. I was in a lot of agony, and I know many of you know what I'm talking about. I was particularly agonized when I didn't know where you were. And if I knew you were safely in treatment or safely at home or whatever, I would feel better. But if I didn't know where you were, that was totally agonizing. And I would be sleepless about that. And finally, and I think, as you said, Susan, meetings are really sort of miraculous to me, because I really believe in this group thing. It works for me anyway. And finally, through the meetings, I learned that I had to do something about this. I could not go on that way. And so I think I let it go. And I had a dream in which I saw you lying in your casket. And I went over and put the lid down in my dream. And I woke up with a different feeling, that this is what I have to do. I have to be well myself. I have to make sure that I'm doing the right things for me. And I need my group to help me do that. And my group wasn't just my 12-step group, it was also my family and my church and so on. But I needed other people to help me do that. But that I had to put myself first and to stay well and sane.
I think that's one of the most moving stories in this book, that story of your dream.
I'd like to say that for the father of a recovering person, there are continuing phantom memories. Even to this day, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I hear a car screech in the street, I sit up alarmed, because that used to be a sign of his trouble. Or if a phone goes off in the morning at 3 o'clock, because we had many phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning, I bolt. I mean, it's been 25 years, 20 years since the last relapse. But there are certain embodiments, they're in your body, memories that, of course, are not the cause for alarm today, but the body still reacts that way. And there are scars in the body that hurt when certain things happen like that, even though I know you're well.
Well, and to that point, the recovering person, or the recovered person, however we choose to describe it, and the nomenclature of our field is another tricky subject for another day, perhaps. Recovered versus recovering and all those things. But you talked about phantoms.
A lot of clarity.
Thank you. There's a lot of, you talked about phantoms, even for people who've have been clean for 18 years and a couple of months now. We still have those phantoms in our minds and in our bodies and in our spirits as people in recovery, and we have to tend to them in the same way that you all, as the parents of the addict, continue to tend to your own wellness. It's never gone.
So when you come home and you say to us, Mom, Dad, go right ahead and have your glass of wine.
Yeah.
Do you really mean it?
I really do. And I'll tell you why I do, because I really mean it.
Well,
and because I want, and one reason is, it's why sometimes we go out to dinner, and when those of us, and I have a lot of my friends in the recovery community are here tonight, and I'm always making a case that people who are normies, whatever that means, should be able to have their glass of wine. In fact, when I see you all have a glass of wine in my presence, it's an affirmation of my own recovery, that you all know that that's not going to sway me one way or the other, because I am the one who has to take care of himself. And to me, when we do that, though you don't do it very often anymore, it's an affirmation of who I am and who you all are.
I think there's there's this thing I call drunkenfreude, where I actually like watching other people drink. It's a kind of flip over that's happened. And my father had it too. He would have people come over when he was sober, and he would mix them these killer martinis. And, they had driven over to the house, and then they would try to get out of the house, and they would be kind of slithering down the steps toward their car, and he would be laughing so hard. He just thought that was the funniest thing, that they got so drunk and stupid. So have another glass of wine. Should we look for more questions?
Here comes one off the side here.
They kind of...
Here's one.
Our system didn't... Oh, there's one right there.
And I'll take this one while...
Take that one.
Because I know you've been waving it. I'll answer that after.
Just answer it.
Oh, this is a really good one. Can I read this one?
Go for it.
Would you speak about the purpose of the higher power and the relationship between the biochemical and spiritual aspects of addiction and recovery? Well, that's going to take about another hour. But there is a relationship, I think, between the biochemical and the spiritual aspects of addiction. I probably would describe it differently than perhaps you would describe it, or other people would describe it. I will tell you this, though. For me, in my own recovery, believing in a power greater than myself is integral to my ability to stay the course, stay sober. I believe that the human brain is a marvelous organ, and that the brains we have are well suited for what we aspire to do. But there are two powers that are greater than me. One is the disease that's trying to kill me. I've clearly illustrated that I can't do that on my own. And the second one is a power greater than the disease that's trying to kill me. And for me, I call it God. People can call it what they want. A lot of people call it the group. There's no doubt for me, though, that I have to put those in that order. A higher power of being greater than myself, my illness, and then me and other things. So definitely there's an integral role that a higher power plays. And for me, it's about staying connected and asking that my higher power do for me the things I can't do for myself. I don't know if you all want to try to answer that, or you want to try to answer it, Susan.
a slightly different question that I think you can just answer very quickly and
William,
concisely with
please
your
talk about your
normal
work in getting
eloquence.
insurance companies to recognize alcoholism and addiction as inherited diseases for this to cover treatment. Well, again, this is a tailor-made question for me because in my role at Hazelden, part of Hazelden's mission is to expand access to treatment. And one of the best ways to expand access to treatment are to make sure that insurance companies cover addictions treatment like they cover other chronic illnesses, that they don't discriminate against those of us or our families who have the illness. I was fortunate to come from a family that had good health insurance and a little bit of extra dollars in our pocket to help get the level of care that I needed. But we worked at Hazelden and with our fellow treatment facilities around the country for years to finally convince Congress that not only is addiction a treatable disease, not only does treatment work, but that insurance companies have an obligation to stop discriminating against people with my illness or other mental illnesses such as depression and others.
Right.
And so we finally got that legislation passed in 2008, and just because of the shootings recently in Newtown, Connecticut, has the Obama administration finally moving forcefully to make sure that that legislation, which was passed in 2008, has a teeth in it that will allow people, many of whom would be here tonight, to access treatment using their insurance. It's one reason why at Hazelden we extend almost $7 million a year in financial assistance, and it goes primarily to employed middle-class people with private health care insurance, whose insurance will not cover addictions as they should. So I hope that answers that question. But we have a lot of work to do, and some of the work we have to do is to educate consumers around the reality that parity in insurance coverage is the law, and that it can make a difference in getting help for you or your loved one.
We've got a lot of great questions now. So my son is in early recovery and is about to transition to a halfway house. What advice do you have for me so that illegible, I think what this person means is, what advice do you have for me?
Are you looking at me, Susan?
I'm looking at all of you, but I do appear to be looking at you, Judith.
Well, I think you're better able to talk about halfway houses. You've been in several.
I've been in several, and a halfway house is a place that allows people to transition out of residential treatment and back into the community where they can not only learn to stay sober, but can get back to work and stay connected and still have that support network. If you're the mother or the father who wrote that about your son going into the halfway house, moving into a halfway house is a great step in the right direction. Another step in the right direction. Hazelden operates a renowned intermediate facility. We used to call it a halfway house. It's called Fellowship Club in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was a great place for me to make the transition, even though I was not yet ready to completely buy into the whole concept of my powerlessness over the disease back in '89. It was in that halfway house, in that community setting where I learned that I belonged and that it was okay for me to be a recovering alcoholic in the community. So finally, just to that end, if your son is moving into the halfway house, be relieved. And while he's in this halfway house doing his thing, you continue to take care of yourself.
If I may,
I have to say something about, we have a new halfway house in New York, which I hope you may have heard of. It's a halfway house. It's not, we don't call it that, of course. We call it Tribeca 12. It's in Tribeca, and it's for recovering college-age students. And we will have eventually, I think it's 30 clients there. If a person is a college student in metropolitan New York, or they can be from anywhere, but of college age, attending a university here, and preparing to enter, and they've already had treatment, they can come to this. Can you imagine sending somebody who's had 30 days of treatment to live in a dorm? And yet, that's frequently that's the only thing available. But if this works well in New York, this will be a model, and I believe this will go all over the country. We know now many colleges have a sober dorm or a sober hall. This is completely different.
If I may say, as an observer, observing William and his peers in his various stages of halfway house, it's very important for the person in the halfway house to have a job. I was impressed, although I was worried as your father, because in your first round of the halfway house, you were doing menial labor, and we didn't raise you to do menial labor. All
Was
that
he
money
good
on
at it?
college and so forth. But you were doing grunt work for less than minimum wage. And I was grateful, first of all, for the people in the community who would hire him and others. And so one of the things we can do as a society is to consider that halfway house residents are normal people in their need for community work and concern. And so working was very important, I think, for you when you were in a halfway.
Every Friday afternoon, I'd come home from my job at a food salvage warehouse in St. Paul. I made $5 an hour. And I would come home on Friday afternoons with $200 in my pocket, and it was the best feeling in the world because I was newly sober, and I knew I was going to be able to keep that money for the things that I really needed to do and not for the drugs and the alcohol that had been fueling my addiction for so long. It gave me a sense of self-worth and esteem in that period of transition, and it was so important for me. I was fortunate to have that experience. And fortunate that the community that I live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, is so accommodating, as is Tribeca 12 now, so accommodating to people like us living right there in the hood. It was great.
So here's a general question for Bill and Judith that I'm going to doctor. The question is, how has this changed you? And I think you've both talked about that very eloquently. So I'd like to know, how has this changed you for the better?
Well, when I introduced myself at a 12-step meeting, I have to say, Judith, I'm Judith, and I'm a fixer. And I always knew that somewhere in here, but I had to finally come to terms with the fact that I am a fixer. And I was born that way, I do believe, because I was fixing things when I was a child. The principal at my grade school called my mother. This was during World War II, and he called my mother and said, Mrs. Davidson, is there any way you can stop Judith from marching the children around the playground? At recess, we're supposed to play, but she won't. She has the marching. And
We still call her Field Marshal Judith in our house.
but, you know, I've made a really good living fixing things. That's what television producers do. Think how many other jobs you're fixing things. If you're a doctor, you're fixing things, right? A lawyer, you're fixing things. If you're a manager of any kind, you're fixing. If you're a mother, I'll tell you the truth, you're fixing all the time. And so what I had to learn was the difference between fixing things and fixing people. And I don't fix people nearly as much as I used to. When I do it, I know I'm doing it, and I tend to try to stop fixing people, because it really can't be done, can it?
So you're saying that you know yourself better than you did before, that
Absolutely.
you've had to look at yourself and ask yourself whether some alterations are in order.
Yeah, there's nothing that sort of takes the wraps off of you, like being in this situation. And I think also group work also does that for you.
I've come to know other people better. I'm sure I've learned a lot about myself in this experience, but I've come to be more empathetic to people about whom I used to have moral judgments. For example, Judith mentioned my uncle. He was a drunk. We let him get away with it. Until he, in a drunken stupor, struck my elderly father. And I flew down immediately from New York when my mother told us that, and I had him arrested. I should have taken him to treatment, and I wouldn't make that mistake again. He's dead. He died a drunk. And I now look at drunks differently from how I did. I think I'm more empathetic to people. I think I would react more as a physician than a preacher today if I encountered that same situation.
Good answers, good questions. All right. For William, did your marriage survive?
No. And we know that addiction is an illness that affects much more than just the person who has it. It affects the family, be it parents or spouses or children, aunts and uncles. And addiction in my life manifested itself in such a way that a relationship couldn't survive. That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation as to why it didn't.
That's one of the reasons I had such anger for you for a while, because I loved your first wife. We brought her into the bosom of our family, and all of a sudden, because of your illness, she was gone. And we had done nothing to alienate her, and still I miss her. And that's a casualty.
There's a lot of casualties with the illness, and those family dynamics are critical to that process.
Here's a related one. What made you want to go home?
What made me want to go home?
Or to finally get sober?
Oh, well, I got sober the morning of October 12th of '94, and at the end of the day, I did want to live. I didn't want to exist the way I was existing. Not that I was going to exist that way for much longer. I was about at the end. What made me go home? I knew that there were people who still loved me, like I said, who hadn't given up on me. And I think deep inside of all of us is that desire, that flame to live no matter what the odds, and no matter what's happening. I had every reason to live. And so because I had the support of my family and my community, and as I said, my employer, who was going to hold me accountable but wasn't going to terminate me until they gave me another chance. That was key. I said, yeah, I am worth it.
Did you have any vision that you would, I don't want to make this sound too treacly, devote your life to teaching what you had learned? That sounds treacly, but
Yeah, I know.
imagine the untreacly version.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to imagine that, but
Okay,
I like the way you said it. No, and I think that's the point. I mean, who'd have thunk it? I used to think that being an alcoholic, drug addict, was absolutely the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And it was bad. But from that opportunity, from adversity, as we say, came the opportunity to take accountability, take personal accountability, responsibility for what my illness was doing to me and what I was doing in my illness. But I didn't aspire to become an advocate or even to work at Hazelden. That came much later in the process. And I think the power of my story, the story of so many people out there today and across this country, is that not only do we make it, but we go back to being, productive members of the community, however we define communities. So I never could have imagined it. I guess that's the point. I never believed I could have become an addict and alcoholic any more than I could have believed that I could recover from it, any more than I would have ever imagined working for an institution like the one I work for with the colleagues I have and helping others answer this now what question, just because I've been there and done that. Amazing.
I want to say that your mother and I talk often with admiration about how you have grounded your sobriety in helping other people. I think I know I used to, maybe you did, resent it when we'd come out to see you in St. Paul, because you were always available to the phone call from somebody in trouble or the knock on the door from the Lutheran pastor who himself was collapsing. And you'd go downstairs and spend 2 or 3 hours with that seeker while we were there and your children were needing you. And we puzzled over that and sometimes criticized you for it to ourselves. But we came to see that, and I've said this about you before, that you don't ever let the sun set without having tried to get one person that day into treatment. And if we kept box scores, I think you'd have a high batting percentage of people who come to you for help, whom you get into treatment. And I've seen you ground your own recovery in helping other people get into recovery. And you would be doing it, if I may say, whether you worked at Hazelden or were back in journalism.
Right. Thanks,
Well,
Pat.
one of the things I learned too, and partly from being in your household, but also in groups, there are so many casualties and so much is lost. There is so much pain. It's just amazing. But there's this some sort of interior spark, whether it's a higher power. There's something that lets people say, okay, I lost my job, I lost my home, I lost my family, I lost my car, I lost my reputation, I lost my pilot's license, I lost my anesthesiologist's license, but I'm sober. It's amazing to me. It's amazing. What people, how they can recover from these huge losses that are part of the illness. They're part of that disease, that there are going to be casualties if you go that way, if you go that way. And one of the things I've said to some people is, the sooner you can find your recovery, the fewer casualties there'll be. Mm-hmm.
And I talk about that in the context too of one of the remarkable changes that I think has occurred even in the relatively short time that I've worked in the field and been sober, and that's to see young people who are becoming addicted at an earlier age. We were experiencing that at Hazelden, but also to see young people getting sober at a younger age and staying sober. I lost the tail end of my teens, all of my 20s, and half of my 30s to this illness. Now, that's not to say I lost everything within that time, but gosh, I spent a long time trying to get on top of something that was cunning and baffling and powerful and patient, as we know. I see young people today, some of them are here tonight, who got sober at 20 and have been sober for 10 years already. Who are finding that there is an alternative to binge drinking on campuses in New York, who are realizing that even though their mother and father didn't get sober, they can get sober and they can live that life. I think that's a great story of hope, that even while we continue to push back against the shame and the stigma and the lack of funding and discrimination, the reality is that a lot of people do overcome the illness.
And that's where we have so many inverted values in this society. I'm like Judith, you talked about our Emmys, but those Emmys that line our shelves are nothing compared to the success of one person who's living a sober life after being through what he went through. And I can only say that because I'm not a recovering person, but I've seen him and others of his peers, and I've seen the people we met in our film, Karen O'Brien and people like that.
You have recovered some.
Well, I've recovered from politics. No, I have. But, it's what infuriates me. It infuriates me to see the way the mass media, the celebrity media, play off of constantly the travails of a Lindsay Lohan, for example, making a running story out of it. She may be a success as the world sees it. She's a failure in the most important requirements of life. I'm not condemning her. I'm only saying constantly emphasizing that somebody is failing is not as important as recognizing that one person is sober. And that's what I think you and your peers prove day in and day out.
She also has parents that are not like you and your wife. And I think it's really important to talk about the role of the parents in situations as you did.
Well, I'll answer quickly and then let Judith respond. But there are parents like us who lost 2 of their 4 sons to addiction. There are parents like us who have paid a terrible price by doing what we did and still didn't, their kids didn't make it. I don't know what the DNA is, but that's right, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And that's another point, that there isn't one size shoe fits all to approaching this problem. I mean, what I do in my life works for me. What Hazelden's mission or Phoenix House's mission or the Salvation Army's mission is, it works for the people that they touch. But parents, there's no simple solution for parents any more than there is for the addict and the alcoholic. And I think the key message is that everybody know that there is hope, and that if you apply yourself either as the parent or the person who's addicted, you can overcome this illness, though every path is different along that journey.
Judith, what did you do? How did you help William? Or did you find a way? How did you balance that? How did you come to a place of peace?
In the beginning, you know, after that day in Harlem, when I found him, when Bill Joseph and I found him, you took yourself back to your house. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't let us do that. You took yourself back, and the next day, you checked yourself into St. Vincent's Hospital. You just walked in there. And as I remember, you said, please lock me up. Mm-hmm. And so that was 30 days there. I went every day to see him. I left my office early and went down there. It was a lockup.
It was a psych ward.
Yeah. And, you know, they frisked me when I went in, and the only things I could take him was water in plastic bottles. And I think they even took the lids off. And I think just the determination just to do that. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what was going on. I'm not sure what the value of that was, except that you were...
Well, you were there.
I went there.
You were there.
And I had no idea what to do, what to say, or anything else. But then we began to look for what the next step would be. What are you supposed to do now? And we really didn't know. And that's how primitive things were in 1989. And as Bill said earlier, we did find a way, and Hazelden turned out to be that place. And so then I think we were told that we might want to come to the family program, and we did that. Not everybody will do that. We did it. Our other two children didn't go, though we wish they were. They were young adults, and they had jobs, and they said they couldn't go. Later, one of them did go to family treatment alone, and I think I started having therapy myself almost immediately, because I realized I wasn't going to live through it if I didn't do that. So, and the group, I think, convinced me immediately when I got to the group as well, that this was going to be a long-term thing. But I don't know. I just followed some sort of instinct, I think. But with the help of knowing people. I tell you what, you really need professional help. The families need professional help, just as the addicted person needs professional help. There's no doubt in my mind.
Right. We're running out of time. Shall we take a couple more questions? What do you think?
You decide.
Yeah, we'll take a couple more before we go.
Okay, so here's a question I like a lot, although it brings up a whole new issue. Doesn't the anonymity in AANA encourage a stigma? Should we not celebrate the fact that AANA are great examples of how together big problems can be solved?
Well, that's a tricky question because I'm not sure there's any sort of consensus on what we as recovering people who ascribe to that type of program should be doing.
There's no consensus.
There's no
I'm
consensus.
here to tell you there's
Thank
no
you.
consensus.
You wrote a piece about it
Right.
recently that's gotten a lot of acclaim, and so has the New York Times has
Acclaim.
dealt with it. It's good. The point is that we don't have a visible and vocal constituency, in part because so many people who do recover from this illness recover in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Al-Anon and other things. And a lot of people feel that they can't stand up and speak out because of the anonymity of the group with which they're recovering. I respect that. I understand that. And thank goodness for that anonymity component, because it has protected these self-help groups for 70 years from self-destructing over things like the war in Iraq or politicians or the endorsement of products. They don't get involved in that, good. But that should not prevent those of us who are in recovery from standing up and speaking out as addicted people, you and me, or family members who are recovering from the son's illness in this case. Because if we don't stand up and speak out, who is going to do it for us? And so I've always respected that tradition of anonymity. At the same time, I've always said that I, William Moyers, can stand up and speak out as long as I do it as an addicted person in recovery and not as somebody who's in one of those groups.
Well said.
As I was very helped, as Judith was. I mean, I knew nothing about this disease, and I was very helped, as Judith said she was, by the family program that we went to and discovering other people like me. I was also helped because when a male would reach out and take me into his confidence and show me his own vulnerability. Lewis Nelson, our friend Lewis Nelson, who's here tonight, reached out to me, not just to both of us, but to me, and invited me to go with him to some group meetings, and those were very helpful to me. They were not like bolts of lightning, but they were like a steady light down the mine shaft that gets closer and closer and closer. And you suddenly realize that you can see a way through this black hole that I talked about, because not only of what Lewis shared, but what the other men. It helped me as a man to know that other men who were proud and public and high achievers were as vulnerable as the person who was down and out. And that's what we can do, what one can do to others, is just to reach out and help them get to a group where the learning, coming back to your question, takes place. It takes place from others. And that's the positive side of this.
I don't know who said it. I think you did early on here. Something about the 1,000 Addicts March on Washington.
Million.
Million march. I love that. I love
Let's
that
do it.
idea.
Come on, Judith.
I'll go.
We'll go. Okay.
You can march us.
We're out of time. Thanks, guys. That was great.
I just don't think it would hurt anybody's anonymity,
I don't
the basic
either.
anonymity, to stand up like that. If women hadn't done that,
If African Americans had that done.
We wouldn't have the
William
vote
will
now.
sign his book in the hallway? What? Back
there's
there.
a good place over there.
Back
now.
there, yeah.
May I say you have been an educator and an
Yes.
inspiration as well.
Thank you, thank you. It's such a thrill to be up here with you guys, really. It's amazing. It
Thank you
makes
for
me
your witness.
Thank you.
feel proud to be an alcoholic.
Yeah.
We should
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.